Welcome to another episode of Social Impact Live. I'm going to have a quick message for you today. I wanted to tell you the inspiring story that I read the other day about Early Walker and the W&W Towing Company. I thought this was a really great example of what it's like to spring into action to create social change without changing your entire life. And so I want to share that story with you here. So I was reading this story on Black News, and it's about, as I said, Early Walker, who's the owner of a Chicago-based W&W Towing Company. When the deadly winter storm hit the state of Texas a few weeks ago, Mr. Walker was flooded with calls and cries for help within the state of Texas. There have been a bunch of reports about deaths and other challenges due to a lack of electricity throughout much of the state, as well as people's inability to move through the state to get what they needed. So people were dying, pleas were going out, and a lot of Dallas residents, as well as civic leaders, were sort of raising to the surface this issue that there were people without water and people who were without food during this crisis. When Early Walker heard about this, now he lives in Chicago, Illinois, right? But when he heard about this, he had this to say, as Americans, we can't sit idle and watch our fellow Americans in Dallas and Memphis endure such abnormal living conditions. The last thing any American should be concerned about is food and water. We have to move fast. So that's a quote that came out from Early Walker, Mr. Walker. And upon receiving these calls, he basically began to organize other folks to try to do something about this issue. He reached out to someone who he's relied on time and time again, which is Mr. Perry Mandera, who runs another trucking company called Custom Companies Trucking. And they agreed to work together to gather donated goods and then ship those goods to Texas in order to help relieve those who were in need. So basically what they did was they ended up setting up a site at Marshfield Plaza in Chicago and gathered hundreds of cases of water, juice, and other items like Tylenol and other things that were needed. And then through the help of Mr. Mandera, we're able to ship those items 954 miles to Texas, which were received at the Inspiring Body of Christ Church. There was a line of people who were there, who were ready and who were waiting to actually receive these items in order to alleviate the challenges that they were facing. And then another shipment also went to a college in Memphis, Tennessee, which was able to reach the residents who were in need there also. As I read this story, as I listened to this sort of account of social impact, what really came to mind for me was something that I've tried to communicate on this channel. This idea that social impact doesn't need to be something that consumes your entire life. It doesn't need to be something you necessarily quit your job for. In fact, oftentimes, I think if you were going to turn that into your full-time thing, not quitting your job to start with is a good idea. But really what this story indicates is that we all have the ability to create social change. We all have the ability to create social impact, to help other people. But what it really does require is gathering our own motivation, figuring out what's needed, and then figuring out how we can organize ourselves and other people to create the sort of change that the world needs. And so when a group of folks led by Early Walker, Mr. Early Walker in Chicago, were able to pull together so many needed supplies for people hundreds of miles away, almost 1,000 miles away, to alleviate pain and suffering there. I just see that as a really great example of the type of thing that many of us can do, that so many of us can do when we take the time to consider our fellow men and women out there. So that's what I have for you today. I wanted to share that story, just an example. I didn't see anything really special about it as far as Mr. Walker contributing outsized funds or having any sort of privileged position that allowed him to sort of create that outcome. I see it as someone who genuinely wanted to do good for other people and who used the abilities he has, the abilities that so many of us have, to make that happen. For Mr. Mandera, for him being willing to donate his trucking service, it seems like that was a phone call that needed to happen, and that he's also someone who deserves some credit for his willingness to volunteer during a time of need. I think we all need to lean into that spirit where possible. So that's my message for you today, is just sort of look at that, simmer in that inspirational story, and hopefully you can use it as fuel for you as you head down your own path. What we do in the world doesn't have to be super huge every single time, but when people are in crisis, I think that's the time where we need to act. And so I'm inspired by the story of Mr. Early Walker and the collaboration with Mr. Mandera as well. And I'll be taking that with me as I move forward. All right, that's what I've got for you today. I'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Social Impact Live.